February 1983, David Cronenberg's Videodrome comes out. Soon after, Jorge Luis Borges puts out one of his last stories, Shakespeare's Memory. I'm your host, Dr. Timothy Wilcox. Join me and my guest, Jeremy Fox, as we experience double vision. All right, welcome to Double Vision. We're talking about the Videodrome and Shakespeare's Memory. I'm Timothy Wilcox, and I'm here with Jeremy Fox. He is a licensed counselor, and he has published journal articles on EMDR and trauma therapy.
Thanks for having me, Timothy. It's exciting stuff. So that's right. I'm a licensed professional counselor. Done a lot of clinical work with trauma. I published an article in the International EMDR Journal of Research and Practice, which I did that. I got an idea for it, and then I explored that. We won't go too much off on that, but that's my background. Is I'm very passionate about psychology, particularly as applied to trauma and PTSD and how it affects the brain. And so when we connected, and you were looking for when you were looking for a kind of discussion partner to talk about a movie did it start with like horror in 1983? Is that kind of what you were looking for? Remind me of how we started talking about Videodrome.
I did mention 1983. So I had this one idea about talking about Blade Runner and William Gibson. And so that's in the same year. But yeah, I had introduced this idea. So the concept here is look at two works, one film, one literary work from the same moment, within sort of months of each other, these come out, and you have these two profound visions, one filmmaker, one literary author, giving sorts of visions in the same moment, and explore that sort of dynamic, what you get out of exploring that pairing. And so I brought that up, and you were immediately very eager to talk about Videodrome, so I'm happy to have you on here to talk about it.
Thank you. Well, and because I remember in kind of the days of like VH1 doing almost Watch Mojo type lists, but when that didn't exist yet on the internet. So like people might say clickbait, I affectionately really enjoy clickbait type stuff sometimes. But I remember seeing like on a countdown of horror movies on VH1, like how Videodrome was like this seminal film on psychological and physical terror of the television and new technology. And so I had to go watch that. And so it very much, I was in college at the time. And so it really dovetailed with a lot of trauma psychology stuff that I was learning. And, of course, the psychology of fear mongering. If anyone who watched the movie will get where I'm coming from with that, like the fear of television or media infiltrating your brain, in this case, in a very literal way, transforming you. And so I've been a fan of the movie and Cronenberg's work since watching that. And of course, I watched Scanners and then his other films. The Brood is another one that comes to mind. Obviously, The Fly. I can just keep going on and on, but this similar theme of like equal parts cerebral horror and physical, visceral gore is really Cronenberg's trademark. So he's one of my favorite directors. So yeah, you're right. I was excited to talk about that because it's been, of course, done, speaking of Cronenberg, on a more literary level, but there's always room for more. And I don't have any awareness of anyone pairing it like a fine dish with a wine that's never been paired like you are with Shakespeare's Memory. So I'm very excited to explore that.
Yeah. So my background is, I have a PhD in English literature, and I tend to think about things in pairings broadly. And so this is an opportunity to really sort of think about literature more broadly and film more broadly, and start to see these interesting moments. And so both Cronenberg and Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote Shakespeare's Memory, they both, I think, are interested in these little thought experiment type works. And this Borges story in particular that I asked you to read, it's one of his last stories that he wrote in 1983. A lot of the stuff that he's really famous for is back in the 1940s. It's also interesting as we're thinking about film, and particularly this film that's like so much about visual media. But so Borges, throughout his life had vision problems. But so he wrote a lot of his famous works in the 40s in a sort of state of near blindness. And then in the 50s, he sort of went completely blind. So by the time he's writing this in the 80s, he's actually been blind for nearly 30 years. And so you have this sense of this highly visual contemporary culture where he talks about that this expectation that the memories would be primarily visual. So the story is about this guy. He gets access to the memories of William Shakespeare implanted into him sort of magically, and he expects them to be visual. And I think that emerges out of our sort of culture where we think of life as this primarily visual medium, when really, it is a lot of other things. And so he finds auditory sensation to be one of the primary things that comes back to him. He finds these things coming to him in dreams, and a lot of these different sensations and blending of things. And then so Videodrome is of course this guy works for a television station. He's trying to push extreme media, and the media starts overtaking his life and body.
Right.
And so could you, so you give a bit of an introduction there about, your sort of introduction to Videodrome and what excites you about it. Can you speak a bit about the, what sort of seems to be Cronenberg's vision with the film, like what's going on in the film?
Oh, 100%. I have the Blu-ray on the Criterion Collection. For anyone out there who's a real cinemaphile, they'll get what that means. You get a lot of bonus content, director and creator sort of commentary. So I watched Cronenberg's actual commentary. So I've already seen the movie, obviously, and so what I did to brush up on it was watch it with the commentary on. So I had a really good kind of backseat view of Cronenberg himself discussing it. And he essentially, of course, spoilers, but if you're listening to this, you probably have already seen it and want to discuss it. But the vision is the transformation of technology. And it's almost a cliche now, but it wasn't certainly when he created the idea that when we use technology, it just as much uses us. So we have Max Wren, played by James Woods, right? And so he's the president of a local access television channel called Civic TV. So he discovers this pirate broadcast, this very edgy titular channel called Videodrome, and he tracks it down, right? And at first he thinks it's in Malaysia. He has his tech guy, Harlan, who does all of the stuff for the channel, the technical stuff, find the channel, and they find out that's being relayed to Malaysia, but it's really come from Pittsburgh, right? And so a lot of the first half of this movie is James Woods' character, Max Wren, trying to find out more about Videodrome. And then the latter half is him finding it and being transformed, literally, again, because that's much of Cronenberg's oeuvre, is his sort of very literalist interpretation that when we go looking for something, or when we find a new technology or something different, or when we try to modify genes in the fly, right? It transforms us just as much as we try to tap into it. So, of course, for people who've seen the movie, the standout scenes are going to be when Woods starts to hallucinate, starts to get an itch on his stomach, and it opens up, and he gets essentially a flesh opening to play VHS tapes. And that he starts to become a pawn, first of Videodrome, which he's discovered by this point to actually be a plot to get people addicted to violence, and the stream and actually gives them, it induces brain tumors from watching, kills them ultimately. So it weeds out people who enjoy the content. And so there's this moralistic political intrigue and conspiracy behind Videodrome, right? As Masha, one of his contemporaries, says, who he gets to track down the channel and find out more, she says Videodrome has a philosophy, and it's dangerous because Max doesn't have that. And she tells him, like, You don't have that, Max. Videodrome has a philosophy, meaning he's looking to peddle the most exciting kind of pornographic material, but Videodrome is looking to actually catch people for doing that, cause essentially an addiction, and kill them off. So by the end of it, one of our protagonists, Brian Oblivion's daughter, Bianca, reprograms through Woods, through Max Wren, his impulse to work for Videodrome. He's being controlled by VHS. She gives another one, and he goes and tries to get rid of Videodrome, to stop it. He kills the creator, essentially, guy who's got a front that's a glasses emporium, very convex, great last name, obviously, for glasses stuff. I'm kind of going on a tangent. I'm summarizing the plot, essentially, but I think the message is, once you engage in overt seeking after novelty in media, it begins to propagate through you, right? And so essentially Max goes from very cynical peddler of kind of pornographic content to essentially first a foot soldier in the Videodrome machine, to then a radical anti-Videodrome campaigner. You can almost look at that as if someone who's been addicted to something and then swings the other way, right, consciously. But in this movie, it's a real metaphor for the power of technology, either to cause you to submit to it, or to fight against it toward the end. So that's the way I would say the message Cronenberg has. Is he actually says TV F's you. Like, that's his in the commentary, and he's talking about how the character Harlan, when it's revealed that he's working for Videodrome, thrusts the VHS into Max Wren's stomach to basically say, here you go, you're working for us. And there's not really a more visceral image of TV violating someone.
Right. Yeah. There's also that interview at the toward the beginning of the movie where it's him and Nikki Brand, and then you have the sort of media theorist, Dr. Oblivion.
Right.
He's there on a television screen. We later find out that he only exists at this point as this giant archive of VHS tapes.
Right.
But so he Max has two sort of drives going on here. One is the sort of drive for money. He explains that they're a small station, and so the way that they are trying to break into the television industry is give what you can't get anywhere else. And so it creates a spiral of, they show extreme content, and then it has to get even more and more extreme because it needs to be always new stuff. And
right.
so part of it, he's having these meetings, and there's like various forms of softcore pornography, and he's like, no, this is too soft, this isn't anything new. At Videodrome is this point where it's like, no, this is exciting, this is something that people aren't getting. But the other thing is so he wants this woman, Nikki Brand. He has a sexual desire for her. He talks about, during the interview, he starts talking about like, oh, your red dress, it's red, it's very stimulating.
Yes.
Freud say, and then there's this sort of, it's like becomes this comic scene where he's like in the background while the host is talking to Dr. Oblivion, and he's trying to ask her on a date and all of that. And
yeah,
she eventually does come over, and so she's turned on by Videodrome. And then so what sort of drives his quest eventually is that she suggests that she's going off to Pittsburgh to try to get on the show.
Right.
And so he wants to know more as this sort of salesman, and then he also has this concern about her. That's partly about her safety. He thinks she's going to die or something, but then also he has these anxieties where she wants someone to cut her and to put cigarettes out on her and all these things that he's selling, but that he's actually not quite comfortable with. But he he wants to be. He has a sense of jealousy. He's like, you let someone else cut you, and so he has this jealousy where he wants to be that other guy that she had this more sort of extreme encounter with. And so going to Shakespeare's memory, there's there's this other sort of dynamic around desire that drives his quest, where he's a Shakespeare scholar and gets sort of ambushed at a Shakespeare conference, where it's like, oh, I can give you Shakespeare's memory, and it's actually this sort of curse. But it's about wanting to, the whole, even before he gets this offer, his whole life is dedicated to knowing as much as he can about Shakespeare and being this authority publishing on Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is already established as this sort of great figure, and so he wants to sort of associate himself into that space and become, the big Shakespeare guy. And then so this is this golden opportunity.
Sure.
But in that drive to be Shakespeare and to inhabit his mind, is sort of, he starts to lose his own identity and his own sort of grip on reality.
Right.
And so you had so you have this psychological background.
Right.
Your thoughts on what's going on in all of those sorts of dynamics, and you commented a bit about memory, and how that the story was actually very astute in describing how that works.
Yes. No, I want to go off on that. I've got a lot of notes prepared. Can I follow up on the Nikki Brand thing for a second?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what's interesting upon a reviewing of Videodrome, and I made sure to linger on the scenes with her at the beginning because I wanted to see how she was introduced. I had this recollection that she was like a psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, whatever. And going through watching the movie, it's curious. I don't hear her credentials mentioned, but she clearly has a radio show, right? And it's interesting because at that time, Dr. Laura Schlesinger and Dr. Ruth Westheimer were very big radio personalities who had those medical psychological backgrounds and would give advice. And so that is a relic of its time. So Nikki's show is called the Nikki Brand Emotional Rescue Show, which is fascinating because you listen to that and there's like, what is Videodrome getting its viewers from? Titillation and brutality. What is Nikki Brand's show getting their viewers from? Emotional brutality, sort of emotional exploitation. People listening and getting an auditory sort of secondhand enjoyment of listening to problems, right? Now, not necessarily enjoyment in the sense of reveling in the other problems, but an enjoyment like fly on the wall listening to another person's inner workings, right? So there's kind of a parallel, not exploitation on Nikki's part, maybe not consciously, but we would say a parallel engagement of like getting people's eyes or ears, in this case for a radio show, listening to painful thoughts and almost a voyeuristic listenership on others' problems, right? Now, of course, you could get help on it, and that's where where it diverges from that. It's like it's not exploitation because you could call and get some help, but you have to be willing to bury your entire identity on the radio, maybe through anonymity or whatever, but if someone recognizes your voice, how about that for confidentiality? As therapists, we typically don't do that because confidentiality. So Nikki's character is fascinating because she's kind of a lampooning, a more extreme version of course, it's Videodrome, it's Cronenberg, he takes it to the nth degree, but of these 80s I'll help you characters. Now, I have nothing rude to say about Dr. Laura, Dr. Ruth. I think they have helped many people, but I think, but what's it, Cronenberg himself was saying they were based on, he based Nikki sort of on that milieu at that time. And so you look at the positive, not positive as in good, but positive as an additive feedback loop between Max and Nikki, and you see that he drags her into, like, his sexual lust drags her into, like, he was asking her on a date, going, like, getting her involved in his world. She sees Videodrome. She introduces Max to her world of more S&M stuff, and he's not quite ready, even though he's exploiting that and using it, which says a lot about, right, like getting high on your supply and that kind of thing. Like, he doesn't really understand it, he just shows it. And so they both heighten each other's involvement in Videodrome. That's something I really picked up on watching the director's commentary and watching, just seeing their dynamic of it. First, on the show, on the public access show, where they're being interviewed, Nikki says that Videodrome's bad for society. And she admits that she lives in a heightened state of stimulation, doesn't think it's good for people to be exposed to more. So there's a little bit of projection on her part, assuming that other people would respond the same way she would, which I think, her argument of not showing public torture and utter pornography on television, maybe good, right? Like, I think that's a pretty good argument, like not to show Videodrome to the public. And later we learn it induces tumors in people. So that's pretty bad too. But it's interesting that her character espouses one thing on the television interview with Oblivion and Max, and then she arguably is just as enmeshed in Videodrome behind the scenes as Max is, especially when she comes to represent the program and, decapitates Oblivion and things of that nature. It's like she's a stand-in for some sort of desire and seductress, even though she's more than that in the movie. With what she kind of narrowed to represent to Max. I don't know why my video is going off there. Let me. Oops. You just take that out here.
So what's interesting though is, I mean, there's the argument that comes up on the TV show, which is this really long-standing debate around things like, does showing violence and stuff on television or whatever cause violence? But then the film actually shows something more nuanced, which is that, it's not even, it's ultimately not even about what you're seeing visually. It's just how that emotionally prepares you for something else to slip in on this lower level.
Yes, it absolutely. And we hear later that the tone of the hallucinations is determined by the emotional tone of whatever is shown on Videodrome, right? Whatever. And so that gets into memory. So that's a good jumping off point. So people with PTSD, sounds, things that remind, smell is especially connected to, smell has like a direct route, the olfactory sense, to the frontal lobe and to memory. It's a very powerful, like, royal road to memory. People think smell is the most powerful sense to evoke memory. That's a big thing to keep in mind. But other senses being this sort of thing that can evoke negative toned memories or positive tones, especially if someone's already in a negative or positive mood state, right, is very crucial to understanding of memory. Like, if someone's in a bad mood, they're probably going to think of more times when they were. And so if someone's, whatever that's called, we call it state-dependent memory, right? When someone's in a certain mood state, it determines what kind of memories they subsequently pull up. And so if something induces a negative or insecure emotional state, people are more likely to be suggestible to different narratives about themselves. And quite literally, trauma can change the brain. People's amygdala, their fear center in their brain, is expanded. It's physically bigger, and there's more activity in it in people with PTSD. And so the amygdala adds emotional tone to memories, and it determines how we process emotional memories. And emotional memories are very, very strongly encoded, right? So anyone with a really humiliating memory or traumatic memory can tell you it's usually stored very vividly. It's usually not an issue with, well, I don't remember that. People can dissociate and not remember stuff, but much of the time, negative memories are actually more easily recalled. And so we could go down that rabbit trail, but to go to Shakespeare's memory, why I said that it was really accurate, the way memory was portrayed, is because we know now, and in the 83 is not ancient history. I mean, I'm going to say for neuroscience, we've learned a hell of a lot more. But even then, we were really getting some flavors for what structures in the brain were responsible for memory. So if you think about it, I know it's a magical realism story. I want to start off by saying I'm not one of the actually crew that can enjoy a nice tale without cloaking it or dissecting it piece by science. But in this case, it actually really works to go through and look at the science, because what we know about memory is that memories are formed. What we speculate strongly, right? I'll say, just like how we speculate psychiatric meds work through releasing neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, right? That's a theory. It's a pretty supported hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis. So memory is essentially created by neurons together firing, and that those synaptic connections strengthen. So there's this Hebbian neuroscience, because Donald Hebb was the one who determined this, the kind of axiom that neurons that fire together wire together, right? And so when you look at something, I'm going somewhere with this. So Long-term potentiation, or repeated firing the same neural networks, strengthens synaptic firing. That's how you have a strong memory, okay? So memories are encoded by modification of synaptic strength. If those synapses are gone, or if they're rewired by an oncoming, let's say, magical transportation of memory, like what happens, memory is also evoked, it's recalled. Like if you're trying to recall a memory, that your theta brainwaves are active in your hippocampus. The hippocampus tells your frontal lobe, like it actually indexes like a librarian in your frontal lobe where the memories are, and so it will help pull those up. And so if someone has Shakespeare's memories replacing their own, and they smell a rose, right? That's apropos for Shakespeare, a rose by any other name, right? Or they see something, and their hippocampus goes to find the corresponding memory of theirs, but it pulls up what would have come up in Shakespeare's brain when he smelled a rose or saw something. That's going to be very disorienting, right? And so, as our narrator said, no one can see a single no one can see in a single instant the plenitude of his past, nor Shakespeare, nor I, his partial heir. Okay, memory of man is not a sum, it is a disorder of undefined possibility. So what I take that to mean is you have a memory cue, your hippocampus tries to find where that is and bring it up, and that's how that memory is activated. Memories are, in a sense, activated. They're not like a one-to-one correlation with the DVD. You put it in, it's the same. Elizabeth Loftus has done some really awesome memory research, like in the 80s and 90s, where people are highly suggestible. Like if you phrase a question, how quickly did the cars crash versus touch, for instance, people who watched a video will give different answers based on how you frame the question. And they've seen the same thing. And so Shakespeare's memory talks about kind of this ephemeral, state-dependent, trigger or cue-dependent nature of memory. And so that's where I was coming from. Like I took notes on him describing memory, like the palaces and caverns of memory. Wow, okay. So there's possibilities there. When our narrator, Herman, is seeing and experiencing things, he sometimes gets his own memory and associations hitting him for these sensations he's having or been linking the memory, and he sometimes gets Shakespeare's, and it becomes increasingly difficult to tear them apart and to extricate it, which would be the case because he's probably just getting some flashbulb memories of things, and it becomes difficult to tell what's what.
Right, yeah, and so he has this scholarly assumption where he almost imagines he's going to have Shakespeare's memory like it's a book and he'll just access it.
Right.
There's the reference to like an encyclopedia, but it's actually, he becomes Shakespeare in a sense where it's all sort of just embedded in him. And so there's this dynamic going on where basically this critique of media where you see, so going back to this idea that it's not even about the visual feed in Videodrome, but that something goes in on this other layer. And so when we were talking about this a bit before, you talked, you had some notes on the soundtrack and such, as that's a big part of what allows certain things to happen. Is so we have this system of memories and identity and so on that we think of as these various like moments and scenes and stuff,
right.
But actually you have this really gory sort of movie, but the soundtrack is what enables it to impart certain ideas. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So one of the things that when I was really first preparing for our discussion here today that I thought about is just how utterly ridiculous, in a positive way, a lot of Cronenberg's imagery is, and how if it veered off one more element of the cinematography or score, you'd have a completely different feel. So the example I used was you've got a TV that erupts in viscera and blood at the end of the movie, okay? And then you have in something like Nightmare on Elm Street, you have when Freddy kills Johnny Depp's character, you have the bed explode in blood, and that almost seems comical in a way. And the movie Nightmare on Elm Street has, even the first one, where Freddy had not been subject to the kind of flanderization or hyper kind of there's a sort of pivot into the most goofy elements of Freddy's personality as the series continues, right? Very kitsch value, very accelerated into this one like quipping kind of personality that's like, oh, that works, you can get people in the seats. But even in the first movie, there's a little bit of a feel of like a campy slasher film. And my thought is with Cronenberg, he avoids that pretty well through his use of music, which was what I was discussing. Like, for me, there's almost kind of a sickening quality to in a good way, again, of the score by Howard Shore and the pacing of the movie. And so you have those things together, like the film really engages in some long form conversations. And even in the director's commentary, Cronenberg discusses the fact that, and the commentary I was watching was made in 2004. So just imagine if we had like a Redux, one that was more relevant to now. Because 2004 was like getting ready for Web 2.0. We can go off on that tangent later. But the fact that the music accompanying the movie is very dramatic, which again, Nightmare on Elm Street has that too. But the actual, how seriously these characters take the situations, and no one is really a caricature. So Max Wren is not like and this is what Cronenberg was discussing in the commentary, Max does not stand or champion the liberal idea of access to information at all costs as a sort of libertarian or classical liberal moral paragon, right? He's not this champion of rights and free speech. He wants to make money peddling shit, right? Like, that's essentially what it is. And so I think that the depth of characters, of complex characters, the music, the tone of the film, the undertones you can read into it in the subtext, all kind of are this amalgamation that make the movie less something goofy. Because, I mean, there was a movie about a killer bed that came out in the 80s, Deathbed, it was called. It's like, how did Videodrome not turn into Death TV? Like something that is just so ridiculous it became a so bad it's good movie. Well, because of the elements I mentioned. Now, I like how you're going meta with this and saying, well, how does that impact us as viewers, right? Like the music, the score, how are we impacted by it? Well, I think it gains our attention, right? Our brains respond to dramatic sounds, to shifts in tone. And again, the movie shifts in tone wildly. It gets campy at parts, but never so much that becomes the movie. Then you go back to a discussion at a table with Max and Masha in like a Greek restaurant where they're discussing the finer points of media. It's like, so you're never left in this campy kitsch region for too long. Your brain doesn't adapt to that and peg this movie as that.
Right. Yeah. And so with from Borges, he distinguishes in the story memory, will, and understanding.
Yeah.
And so what the scholar Hermann Sorgel finds is actually Shakespeare's memory is not very useful to him at all, because it tells him actually very little about how Shakespeare was able to create these plays and these sonnets and so on that are so sort of insightful. The memory is not the understanding or the will that explains how it is that these sort of trivial occurrences, and he finds that actually his own life is on a surface level like more interesting and exciting than Shakespeare's was, but what Shakespeare had was this ability to transform that into something really quite powerful. And so that brought me back a bit to something I was thinking about with Videodrome, which is that we see various forms of TV, not just the sort of hyper violent Videodrome, but there's no like example within the film of like this is what a good TV show or film or something is. Though I'm sure Cronenberg would himself consider what he was doing sort of quality and valuable in a way. You had mentioned in your notes, for instance, that this same year is when Return of the Jedi came out, and Cronenberg said he wouldn't direct it because he wanted to only make things that he had complete control over. And so he has these sort of standards of like what a good, highly creative media production is. It's not all just critique, this is a bad thing that must be destroyed, but there are those anxieties there. And so that's where I think a bit about that sort of meta level where it's like, what separates Videodrome, like Cronenberg's Videodrome, from Videodrome, the sort of supposed pirate broadcast that turns out is actually like a military operation.
Right. It's a great question. Yeah, he was actually. So here's what's really hilarious about something that listeners may not know. Really, really hilarious about Return of the Jedi. David Lynch was offered the chance to direct it. Now that would have been wild, and so was Cronenberg. So the two Davids. So they didn't. But I mean, I have to say, wouldn't you love to see what either of them or both of them would concoct for a Star Wars movie? I mean, that would have been amazing. We know Lynch did Dune, which he really, really, really distanced himself from in the ensuing years. Did not like the way that turned out, which, I mean, Dune is just really a difficult to film book. I mean, apparently there's a new version of it just waiting on the shelves until theater goers can come back, because it was going to come out next month, as you know, probably. But now that's delayed till next year, October. So, but anyway, yeah, the meta element. I mean, I think we can look at that and say, I mean, that's a very good point, because for me, it's funny. When I was just getting into the horror genre, Videodrome had this ineffable pull. I saw little clips and I heard people recommend it on TV or online or in books. I've got this book that I heavily recommend to everyone, this 500 Essential Cult Movies book. I still have it. I got it from Urban Outfitters. So, and I think I'd seen Videodrome since then. So that was just par for the course, seeing it recommended in there. I was like, yeah, it's a good movie, of course. But watching the film about people searching out a broadcast, but searching that out and being kind of in hushed tones and being an indie movie, right, for years, and it still is, but I mean, it has a little more notoriety. I think you've got a point there, and it was difficult. So the movie, Cronenberg said, was marketed very poorly, or like as a blockbuster, and so I'm sure what happened in a few cases is people went to see it and they were expecting a big budget, fast paced, swashbuckling sci-fi film. And it isn't that. And it doesn't try to be that, but the marketing department billed it as such. So, I mean, it was deemed a commercial flop. I mean, Cronenberg readily admits that. And so it did gain an underground cult audience, just like the channel Videodrome, arguably. But it's fascinating because you're right. In that case, life imitates art. So make a movie about something underground and very ephemeral and ineffable, and it's, you have to see it, like the waves of the TV influence your brain. Literally, it's like, oh wow, okay, so that's you got an audience that didn't all connect there, and that were kind of underground and seeking it out.
Right, but then there's also this this sense of guilt, where, so in the film, he's going and sort of seeking out Videodrome, and then he has this impulsion to sort of share it and so on. But in the story, right, it's the same. There's a similar sort of dynamic where he finds that like the Shakespeare's memory is destroying his life.
Yes.
Someone else imposed it on him at the Shakespeare conference. And so the story ends where he's like, decides he's got to get rid of it. And he just starts calling up random people until he finds, some sort of guy that seems like he might be receptive, and he's like, hey, do you want Shakespeare's memory? I gotta warn you, it's not good. It's a very somber thing. And the guy is just like, okay, sure. And
why not? Why the hell not?
Yeah, I found it sort of comical how quickly that exchange goes, where it's like it makes sense for the narrator to take it, but then on this random person on the telephone is just so quickly like, that seems interesting, I'll take that. And, and just so takes that on, and so it's, as the story shows, it's this really crippling burden that is like threatening to destroy his sanity in a similar way to Videodrome. Is like, there's this idea that your reality is already half video hallucination. If you're not careful, it's going to become complete video hallucination. And so it's offloaded over the telephone in Borges' story. And so I'm interested in that sort of that impulse where it's like, oh, I'm cursed with this understanding, and now I need an audience for this that will take this away from me.
Right. Oh, that's a great conversation. And that's one of the first things I noticed about the correlations of the two stories. The strongest correlation there, really, you've got, I've seen this and you have to as well. And not even explicitly, but like as you aptly put it, and as I had said in the notes, I think the compulsion to share. So Freud spoke about the repetition compulsion, or the sort of impulse to do things like repeatedly that happen, to seek out, let's say, relationships or situations similar to ones in which you were traumatized, but this time to get it right, to work through it. And so it's a very nuanced topic that I'm not going to boil down, but I will say in many instances, it's we as human beings adapt to what is familiar, not to what is good for us. And so situations that feel familiar feel safe because we know we can account for what's going to happen. And so that's a mouthful. And we also want people, we want to feel heard. We want people to bear witness to what we've gone through. There's a therapeutic quality to that. And as a therapist, I've got kind of that, there's that old adage, to a hammer, every problem's a nail. Well, to a therapist, everything's psychological, right? And so when we look at it and we see that Max wants people to see this so that they believe what is actually on the TV at this time, that's a key element there. Now, we don't know his history. We don't know, which is very interesting, because if you think about it, we can infer some things from Debbie Harry's character, Nikki Brand. We can infer that she has a history of sadomasochism because she's very adept at discussing like different topics in it. She has some visible body modification scars, right? By the way, Cronenberg named her after the nicks she had on her shoulder, the nicks, and then Brand was the cigarette branding her. So that's some trivia there. So she probably has some history of involvement in S&M and deeper than, I mean, we just talked about that. And Max is shocked at her burning herself with a cigarette, but to her, this seems just like old hat. This is yesterday's news. She does that all the time for breakfast. So she's interested in this channel on a personal level, and basically like she wants to go audition for it. It doesn't get much more personal than that. And so she's on this trajectory to ride the novelty of it. And as a clearly intelligent woman who spends her time doing self-help stuff, there's kind of an emotional and cerebral impulsion there. Whereas I think Max's is at first just cerebral, but on an exploitative level, where I want to see what I can do with this. Very much kind of boiling it down to whatever feasible financial gain and get from, and of course, like just being interested. Then he falls more into that trajectory of experiencing it. But there's an element there of, I've seen something so shocking that I need some validation. And so what came up to me is this idea of old internet things like rotten.com, where they would have some just awful imagery of different like car crashes and things, and kids in the 2000s like, dude, did you see that stuff on Rotten? You got to see this, bro. And then seeing people's reactions, right? And so not only getting the satisfaction of kind of pranking them, but also of seeing their reaction to something that you've already seen and judging that, and kind of a perverse fellowship there of human emotion. That comes to mind. and things like The Gauntlet, where you watch disturbing videos and see if you can take it, right? It becomes a litmus test in many ways. And so when we look at Shakespeare's memory, equally, we get the kind of like, we get our opening character, Daniel Thorpe, who's this haggard cynic who's saying, I can give you this gift and you can take it here, Mr. Herman Sorgel, scholar of Shakespeare, but I'm going to let you know what comes with it. So this person wants to offload it. And then Herman, I think that Shakespeare's memory is actually a bet, which is interesting to say, but I think Shakespeare's memory is a far better illustration of the way trauma works, of like an abuser then thinking that it's okay to do certain stuff to someone else and abusing them. A sort of one-to-one correlation there of someone inflicting something and someone else inflicting that, and a loss of innocence almost. Then even Videodrome, which is interesting because there's less gore. And so there's no gore. It's a story about Shakespeare's memory, for God's sake. But you get this idea, and it's more like infiltrating your brain on a level where you don't even know what's hallucination and what's not, which also, as you very capably pointed out, what is the case in Videodrome, right? So with Shakespeare's memory, what I noticed there is the kind of tragedy that the narrator, his neural networks are wired to analyze and pick things apart. And so his memory, his executive process of the brain, we could say executive functioning is actually a function of the brain. It's something that happens in the frontal lobe. And so he correlates and analyzes things, right? But Shakespeare's, so what the narrator got is like Shakespeare's episodic memory, right? He didn't get Shakespeare's capacity to link ideas, Shakespeare's creativity. It's like the monkey's paw or something where it's like you wish for something and you should have said one word different to get a different thing. Like wish for Shakespeare's creativity, you could write sonnets about pouring concrete, right? Like you need his capacity to link unrelated ideas, the faculty of creativity and production. You don't need his raw memory of some flowers in England, right? Like that's not the thing that's going to give you that power to write. And so our narrator finds that out, and he just actually starts losing his own memories to Shakespeare's, and that's what he got out of it, worse than if he hadn't had it. And so that was an interesting point that I brought away from it, is the memories he got were just things that he would bring up if something would have reminded Shakespeare of a time. It wasn't proactive. It was all reactive recollection triggered by imagery. And you see this in Borges' stories. You see this I'm not going to say almost, this obsession with memory. You see it in his story about someone writing Don Quixote from memory, right? You see it in a story that he does called The Gods Script, which I heavily recommend, where someone tries to analyze, someone actually keeps their sanity in prison, in an Aztec or Mayan prison, by reciting their memory of events and indexing it because they're so lonely. It's like his obsession with memory was so thorough. Anyway, that's a lot to dump, so you can react, but I thought I would throw that stuff out there.
Right, yeah. There's actually an interesting companion story, Funes the Memorious, where it's about someone who is also by Borges, but it's someone who he hits his head, and so he gets two abilities. One is this like absolute perception, where like he takes in all details of all things in his visual range at all times.
Yes,
and he cannot forget anything ever. Mm-hmm. He remembers everything perfectly, and it's this interesting thought experiment of like how you would understand the world when that's possible. And so he becomes obsessed with this idea of like, what if I just replace all numbers with like my own system? And so like 530 will be 9 and 532 will be school bus. And so the narrator is like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. That makes things way harder. And he can remember this whole insane system so perfectly well. He doesn't understand why that wouldn't be like a better system.
Yeah.
Because each of those words is so much more distinct than just saying 1, 2 and various different variations. But so in Shakespeare's memory, there's a vision that's sort of similar to in Videodrome, but the way in which this sort of added reality offered out through media is so you sort of cannot get it outside of it. You know, this idea that your reality is already half video hallucination. There's no sense in which Max can make his reality less than half video hallucination. That's just already baked in.
Right.
And in the same way, supposedly in Borges' story, the idea is that once you give away the memory, it's supposed to just be gone. But what he finds in the end is he's still seeing these things in his dreams that he's pretty sure is Shakespeare dreaming. And so there's the idea, it comes up of Thomas de Quincey's idea of the brain as a palimpsest, where you have these paper documents where text is sort of chemically erased and written over, but all of those layers are still there and can be brought back up through sort of a chemical means.
Right.
And so the all of that is always there. And so to your point of trauma is this interesting moment where, by virtue of having something like the telephone, you introduce this possibility that someone can just call you and like speak to you for like a minute and just like drop something on you that, like, even if you don't really remember that conversation very well, you never seen this person's face, it just implanted there. And now that's like part of who you are, and you can't get away from that.
Oh yeah.
And so there's this dynamic in which the media is changing you, and so what's really interesting in Cronenberg's vision, because he's working in a visual medium, is it becomes this visual change done through these sorts of like interesting looking, practical effects of like the body horror element, where it's not just that there's something emanating from the television, it's that the television becomes this like veiny, bulging mass, and the screen bites him, and then his body is morphing. He develops the slot you mentioned, and his hand turns into the gun, and all of that. And so as Cronenberg envisions it, it's this real body horror where it changes. It's the idea of death to Videodrome, long live the new flesh.
Right.
And so even as he goes off to try to defeat Videodrome at the end, supposedly, he's permanently altered within this new mediated reality that physically alters his body. And so Borges, it is interesting where it has this fantastical layer where it's just a sort of magic spell of transferring the memory. And I did think there was an interesting line where it seemed almost like a computer upload, where it's like, all of a sudden it's like actually not this instantaneous transfer, but it's like, oh, it'll take time for it to go from me to you, and as if it's like uploading,
a file.
Yeah.
Like a wire in the past or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it completely changes the narrator even after he offloads it. There's still this lingering difference that's there.
Well, let's get really wild with that, because that's also one of the things I pointed at, that when I put like that brief thing in my notes of this is very similar to the way memory actually works, or very associatively. It's like, so let's say that someone were to get some alien memory, and it's from another source, and it kind of comes and colonizes your own networks. And it wires together synapses that you didn't already have wired together, right? And so you have additional memories, because when we remember new things, it's not like we forget old things necessarily at all. So let's kind of say, well, maybe it wouldn't be catastrophic if you uploaded someone else's memory into yours, and it would just connect new neurons, okay? We can say that. But then what happens when you remember their memory with your brain? You've just created that neural network in your own brain in a different spot, that even if you erase the copy, even if you erase the original, you've got the copy in your brain. So you can't just delete. If you upload someone else's memories and you think about them, you're thinking about the memory. You've laid down a new memory. You can't erase that. you'd have to erase your whole brain at some point, probably. That's because memory is very messy. And it isn't just, we don't have these little file cabinets mentally in our brain. Our brain is not a DVD shelf. Essentially, it would be more, this is where Cronenberg-esque stuff comes in, because it kind of bleed through a physical and ephemeral comes into play here, where memories blend into each other. They affect one another. There's a lot of instances of like memory issues where someone believes something really happened, and it's because they watched it on TV at a young age and they thought it happened to them later as an adult because the memory was so fragmented. So if you were to really take on someone else's memory, there is a great chance that even when you offloaded the original memories, that you would have these weird spectral sort of invasions that are echoes of the memory, but that are echoes because you copied them and you still have a copy of that in your brain. You have the copy of the original memory. So that's also what I found fascinating, and kind of some real world stuff there is like when people have a traumatic event happen and they encode it and then they think about it, they get afraid of that fear inducing memory. And then that fear element builds to where then the memory is more imposing than the event even was. And that's a mouthful for something very traumatic. So there's a sort of meta memory element here where that when we think about trauma, we often think about the worst of the worst, which is fine. We need to realize how bad those things are. Varying levels of trauma. I would argue that anything that causes you to have involuntary negative memories of it is essentially a traumatic event. Now, whether you want to say that's a lowercase t trauma, which in my therapy of choice, EMDR, that I do with clients, which by the way is based on eye movement. So that's a whole thing. Like in Videodrome, this idea, Oblivion spells out basically the map to how Videodrome works, which makes sense considering he invented it and it was used in a rogue way. But you've got this idea of the mind's the TV being the new retina, right, of the mind's eye, and then the eye being the window of the soul later in the eyeglass company, them using that as the mediate, I'm talking about mediated persona here. I'm going through my notes. Okay. So Spectacular Optical talks about how the eye is the window of the soul. And Oblivion says that the TV's become the retina of the mind's eye. And so you've got this, that builds the bridge that what you're looking at through the TV directly impacts your soul. And so, in other words, we could go secular and say memory, right? Like I'm Christian, I believe in a soul, but also you could say that there's memory here. And so when our good friend Max watches Videodrome, it infiltrates through the TV, through Max's eyes, changes him on a fundamental level that there's no going back from. Right, so Cronenberg has pretty explicitly laid these breadcrumbs out here. Maybe explicitly if you've watched more than once and catch that, right? I'll say that. But so that's very interesting to me. Is Videodrome is a memory, essentially. It forms a memory that then colonizes your brain in a physical way, based on negative imagery. Negative imagery is very potent. It does create a stronger reaction, which creates a stronger memory, right? So you've come back to that point repeatedly, that Videodrome, it's a signal that physical changes ride in on. Well, to be honest, if something were going to do that, it would need to be probably pretty emotionally charged. So that's par for the course that it's so horrifying, because horrifying things tend to be memorable.
Yeah,
we have to survive. We have to realize that. Yeah.
Well, there's a key moment that like completely like makes the sort of whatever is like the surface level reality of the plot impossible to follow, where it's like they put this helmet on him and we're like, we're going to record one of your hallucinations. And so they never show them like actually taking that off. And so there's no like objective point of like, when does that hallucination end? But then it also blurs, as you're describing, this idea of what is this like machine induced hallucination versus what is just, well, he's seen Videodrome before, and now his memory of it is overtaking his reality. And that becomes the sort of same thing, impossible to sort of differentiate. And there's also an interesting thing with the Borges story where we see how our thinking shapes our ability to live in certain sort of technological societies where there's a moment where Shakespeare's sort of thoughts are overtaking his own, and he's becoming more Shakespeare than Herman. And
Right.
And so
he's more machine than man now.
Right. And but all of a sudden he like forgets what a train is, because Shakespeare wouldn't have recognized it. And so there's this train that's speeding past him, and there's all sorts of metal and glass, and it's going fast, and it's making all this noise, and it's like he's like losing his mind a bit, which reminded me also of the beginning. The parable this is introduced is there's giving away Shakespeare's memory, but it's like this old fable of a ring that allows you to hear what birds are saying, and the guy is like, it's some guy probably has it he lives somewhere where there's no birds, and Herman Sorgel is like, or maybe he lives somewhere where there's so many birds it's all just noise and he can't even like notice that the birds are saying things, which is actually something that happens at the early on in Scanners. Is the guy can read minds, but when there's so many, you just can't even like actually pick out thoughts. But so he can't recognize the train, and then you have the introduction at the end of the telephone as this disrupting thing where you're passing on this magical memory. You know, at first it's person to person, you know, directly like in the flesh, but then the phone allows you to just like dump these things on strangers at this remote distance, sort of randomly. And so now this disrupts things in an interesting way, which actually I think goes back to an interesting point you were saying very early on about this introduction of radio-based therapy, where it's like you get the help, but in order to do it, you have to broadcast all of your sort of deep personal thoughts onto public radio.
Oh yeah. Just that little minor detail.
Yeah. So that's this sort of interesting point to maybe lead into. You had some thoughts about these sorts of crafting these sorts of personae. What was your point with that about the crafting of sort of persona and then how we sort of do that now?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So, boy, I have some points on that. And one thing I would say is to go back to the power of the phone versus the TV with Videodrome. It's very interesting to consider the psychosexual perversions that accompany the phone. So back in the day, you'd hear about back in the day, it's not ancient history, the Scream movies. The killer makes inappropriate phone calls, which is kind of a riff on, it's like, I'm calling within the house. It's like very fear-inducing and terrorizing. And that's something like people calling and you hearing heavy breathing on the other end of the phone, someone knowing they're making you talk, typically someone who has some very exhibitionist antisocial tendencies, right? We could say calling a woman or someone and hearing their fear, making someone respond to you, making someone acknowledge your efforts at doing something to them, right? Your causality as a causative agent that came with phone calls, right? With the phone, the ability for someone not to see your face and for you to be able to do that. And so we see that in the Shakespeare's memory story. The phone is also used as an agent of kind of terror, but on a level where it's a more professional thing of you can have this, you know, there's no way you're going to know what it is. If I tell you it comes with risks and it will kind of colonize your personality, you're not going to know that fully until you experience it, because it's not something like, you know, people having a memory growing up of stubbing their toe and being like, it's going to feel like that. There's probably nothing that feels like having your memory taken over and subsumed by Shakespeare's, arguably, unless it's dementia or something like that. So it's interesting, like the phone was used as a more informed way, like even getting someone's consent to give them their memory. It's a consent based on the fact that they're trusting that they can handle it, which we know no one can. And so the issue of consent is something someone could really tear apart in Shakespeare's memory. But anyway, back to this idea, because I really want to get into this. So the character Brian Oblivion is so pivotal to the Videodrome movie for many reasons. But one of them that's the dearest to me is his espousal of the fact that we'll all have television names or special names that cause the cathode ray, the TV, to react, right? To respond in some way to get our actual point across, to resonate, right? And so that's the word used, resonate. And so, you can ponder that. And so this movie was released at a time when Gen Xers were younger. The yuppies, the children of the 80s that were growing up then, a generation after the boomers, right? So people need to get that straight, because Gen X are not boomers and vice versa, right? Gen X is that generation that was in the movie Slackers by Richard Linklater. So just to get that out there. So Gen X, though, which was being spoken to in Videodrome at that time, did not have TV names. That didn't come to pass, okay? But it did come to pass for their offspring, the millennials, especially the millennials, the older ones now, who grew up in a time with AOL Instant Messenger, where you craft a TV name that resonates, an internet name that resonates. You craft something like Marilyn Manson fan 6969. It's like, ooh, that's got some edge to it. That makes the internet resonate. It's like, oh, okay. So now we're seeing Cronenberg's works come to pass in 2003 or so, right? 20 years later. And so that's why, people talk about how prophetic and prescient the movie was. And I think there's no way to overstate that, quite honestly, because the fact that you just substitute internet for TV is really powerful. And the fact that Oblivion has these two-way conversations as a TV screen, that's Zoom. We're doing that now. So anyone can cultivate a sort of mediated personality, and anyone can cultivate this parasocial one-way contact that even feels like it's two-way. So Quentin Reviews is a YouTuber who was doing a video about Blue's Clues and how when he was growing up, he really felt like Steve was talking to him, right? And so we have that being done on kids. And Steve himself, Stephen Burns, the actor that played Steve on Blue's Clues, was very, very anxious about that. He was very responsible. He was thinking, I'm talking to these kids and they believe I'm talking to them. How ethical is this? Even if it's about birds and the handy dandy notebook and clues, right? It's like, what is this? Is this an okay form of communication? And so we see Nikki as a version of that, and Oblivion. They're both. People might not put that together immediately, because Brian Oblivion is so very scholarly and very, we could say, almost like dictatorial, and has this quintessential, very academic energy, almost an elitist masculinity about him, especially from his ornate wooden chair, which we discover the amazing immaculate office at the cathode ray mission that his daughter Bianca is using. But when we see Nikki has a much softer version of that, where she's speaking to her audience on a one-to-one level. And so she's become this personality. You can hear her authority, actually, in the one scene. I wish they had deleted scenes where she had that radio show and did more of those calls, because that could really give us an idea of how she speaks from her authority, because she's very authoritative with her listener who's crying. And Nikki says, I've got your number, haven't I? AKA in the 80s, that speak for, I know what you're saying, right? I've got you read. I know what you're talking about, and I've pegged you. And so you can hear she's actually pretty assertive, and she's not always that way. And the whole S&M thing and switching is all about like being dominant and submissive at different times. So you get a lot of Debbie Harry's character, Nikki, being submissive in the movie in some ways, although it's a very sort of bold submissiveness, which is not too much of a misnomer or too much of a contradiction for S&M culture. That's par for the course. But you can kind of get that flavor, like she may be submissive, but she's very articulate and very, very much communicating her truth. But she's not submissive at all, even in the slightest, on her radio show. You could even say she's almost a bit gruff, right? So what does that say about these mediated personae? Well, the sort of parasocial relationship of these personalities, of effect of these personalities, is I have this knowledge, come and drink from this source. It can be two-way, but a lot of the time it's one way and people are imbibing it, and your TV name becomes who you are. And so it's like Flandersation, again, that term that comes from The Simpsons, where Ned Flanders becomes essentially an archetype. When you become defined as an archetype, that's it. Like that's your, like almost if you become defined by Shakespeare, right? By his memory, you become this thing in a box and people look to you that way. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah. I mean, also there's an interesting thing with so it's La Memoria de Shakespeare, which, I think there's actually like a double meaning there, where it's like Shakespeare's memory is a thing he gets, the memory that belonged to Shakespeare, but then also broadly the memory of Shakespeare that sort of permeates our sort of culture and the history of literature and such, right, is something that he's already sort of obsessed with, which is something I thought about a bit when you were talking about, like, someone makes this AOL name like Marilyn Manson 6969. You're situating yourself in relationship to this other person's other identity is already something we do culturally, even if you don't get like the actual memory uploaded into you. And so the interesting thing to me with Oblivion is his idea that, he'll sort of die off, but he'll continue on as this archive of tapes. And then that's actually more real than his supposed reality of being alive. Similar to what Herman Sorgel finds, is that Shakespeare's memory is less real than this actual archive of like Shakespeare's literary writing. It creates this Shakespeare that someone making like the AOL name like Shakespeare 90 is understanding,
absolutely,
right?
Fandoms,
right. And so there's this this way in which you see through Oblivion as a sort of pioneering media scholar that we're not just consuming media, but that it trains us to then also create media, and we start to create ourselves as these media persona, and which has become much more thoroughly realized through sort of computers and social media and stuff, where you can really create these sort of very elaborate things, and you can put it out there to this like global audience, but you already have those sorts of dynamics with Videodrome and the telephone and such.
Right. And so tell me about your familiarity with the kind of mediated persona, because the only references I see to those are some academic articles. Where do you get that term from?
I mean, I guess
No, it's a very good term. I'm just curious.
Yeah. I don't know. A lot of things. I think Anne Catherine Hales is one of the sort of big scholars I think about a lot. Talks about things. She has a book. For instance, My Mother Was a Computer. Talks about things like that. That we we sort of inherit those sorts of things.
Yes.
But yeah. So there's that whole medium, and it's interesting. There's these sorts of stages to it, where certain things, like, they start to seem sort of outdated as in the theory world. Things start to seem sort of outdated decade by decade, where it's like something based around just 90s television or something. All of a sudden now we have smartphones and all the social media and stuff, and it's like it doesn't quite capture the richness of it, even what was sort of existing back then that we didn't really quite recognize. But what you get out of these creative works, whether it's film or literature, is these sorts of really deeply penetrating, lasting visions, which is sort of part of the core idea of this, is going back and seeing, what is the vision in 1983 of, Borges and of Cronenberg and and that gives you something really interesting. And as you were saying, Cronenberg's vision is deeply prophetic. And so while we'll still read and study stuff like Marshall McLuhan's theories about media, there's
Right.
also then critiques of that, very correction of this and competing theories and all of that.
Right.
There's not really in the same sense like a competing theory of Cronenberg. It's this creative vision, and so we can look at Borges' vision as well, but it's not about being who's the correct scholar.
Right.
They sort of overlap and give the sort of double vision into this sort of moment that I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, I like that you're calling your podcast here, this Project Double Vision. The phone. Well, I think the big difference is for Videodrome, the video is the technology is the movie. That's what it's about. For Shakespeare's Memory, the telephone is at first glance and sort of in the story kind of secondary. So it's the vehicle through which the vehicle of Shakespeare, his memory, is shared. And so I think it's really good for us to analyze the telephone as the element by which that happens, because it happens in person too. The dude accepts the memory. It's like a vampire. You have to invite them into your house, right? Like I just now thought of that. Like the way Shakespeare's memory works, there's a lore there, albeit for like the 8-page story. So it's not a rich lore, but it seems to kind of feed off of that classical idea of there was at least a choice at some element for you to let this monster into your house. Either the monster of depersonalization via someone else's memories or a literal vampire. So, and for one thing, Borges' stories are very rich and have a diversity of themes. Cronenberg's oeuvre is very rich as well. I think his themes are a little more closely configured, where you have more data points and they're tighter together and you can triangulate more. So, okay, the impact of technology or external forces on the body, right? That becomes a clear theme because it's borne out in several movies. And with Borges' work, it's eclectic, and the ideas of knowledge, memory, identity are borne out in ways that are maybe a little wilder all over the place, because because he was a very prolific author, and of course Cronenberg's a prolific director and filmmaker, but he's got fewer movies than Borges has stories, right? So it's a tighter corpus of work from which to analyze, I would say, when it comes to Cronenberg. That's why there's not as many competing theories, is because I think people have pretty well figured out what's being said. Now, what they haven't done is tied it to a lot of other phenomena that you can always tie it to. But like what I'm doing with kind of, and I'm sure someone's done it, like with the early 2000s screen name culture. And I think one of the bigger things to keep in mind with that is just the fact that the name, like if you look at it now, I was thinking about this. You get, he was right for a period of time, and he still is, but okay, so follow me on this. So screen names were really big in the early 2000s. Why is that? Well, it's like there wasn't a lot of video on AOL or anything like that. There was like you just spoke, and I think there were voice messages. So what does that lead more to? Anonymity. What does that lead more to? People deciding who they are. Now, if you look at a lot of TikTok stars now, like which is the emerging, it's newer than it's newer than YouTube, it's newer than anything else online, really. TikTok stars like Charlie and Dixie D'Amelio often go by their real names. Why is that, do you think? I would say it's because no anonymity. You want the fame. You don't want an alt personality, right? You want it known that this is you. And so for a while, like, hold on a second. Sorry, my dog's scratching.
Yeah, but there's something I think glamorous about this idea of that's inherited from this long history of film and TV culture. But there's something that we sort of just intuit as glamorous about, like a name being a celebrity name that we haven't quite learned about, like, you know, there are certain people who are like really famous as screen names or usernames or whatever, but I don't think that has quite permeated culturally yet.
So yeah, I think that, so you're saying culturally everyone doesn't use a screen name because they just haven't been exposed to it or found out that it's something they want to do?
Yeah, I think that will it could expand more and more. This, because I mean, another theorist I thought about as you're talking is Sherry Turkle. You know, there's these really, you know, really dynamics where we learn to have these, you know, sort of second lives on the screen,
right?
And it's this interesting creative act that, you know, also then obscures how real it is to sort of shape ourselves in this way,
right?
But I think, you know, over time, you know, we're already at a point where people are identifying themselves more and more with these sort of mediated constructions. I think the name is definitely something that will sort of at least in that sort of space fade away, where, you know, you have, you know, 100 years of named like film stars that are the sort of like, or music stars that are like these sorts of foundational cultural images. But, you know, as more and more people sort of make big on, you know, the sorts of like username, brand name type things, I think people will, you know, inevitably more people will follow those models and will sort of go off into that direction. And that's, I think in some ways, you know, it seems like this digital construction, but that's also a part of what I think Cronenberg is imagining with this idea of the new flesh. It's like that becomes you. And to bring it back to the phone, so you had these notes about how in answering the phone, even before he gets the offer of Shakespeare's memory, in answering the phone, there's this acceptance of this, you're agreeing to speak to someone innately. And there's this wider dynamic where as we get more and more mobile technology, you know, people will go out into a public space and have the private conversations on their cell phones. And we grow to accept that. I have a very this sort of media moment that I love from the finale of Seinfeld, where it's like Jerry Seinfeld says the cell phone walk and talk is the lowest form of communication. And this sticks out to me every time I see the episode of like just how dated that is, where, you know, now it's so much more than that, like almost sort of unquantifiably more than cell phone walk and talk being normalized.
Oh yes. I mean, look, you see, it's like, yes, that's outdated, but it's outdated because everybody got the memo. Like, why is it outdated? Well, because collectively as a society, implicitly really, without like a formal declaration, like there are with laws of theft and murder and things like that, you know, society declared, we're just going to do this now. Like, we're just going to walk around and talk. And that, you have to imagine like the first 100 people to do that, and then the first 1,000, and then the first 10,000, et cetera, et cetera. It'd be interesting to consider, right? Because I've never considered that before, the idea of early adopters of the cell phone walk and talk, but there had to have been statistically people who were the first to do that. And what they were probably engaged in business, I would think, or something, because they already have a cell phone, and so they're probably upwardly financially mobile. They need it probably for work because that's a tax write-off potentially, and so again, that lends to that point. And so you'd see people walking around that, and the pioneers, and then there's like, oh, okay, well, that's just normal. Like, we can, and why does that become normal? Because there's no altercation or divergence from that, or seeming sort of counterpoint or social shaming. Now, in restaurants, if you're speaking really loudly on the phone, people will look at you because you're interfering with their direct experience. But public walkways and public outside spaces are now considered basically an extension of our own egos, and we just happen to collect there, right? An extension of our own private worlds. And so I can't take full credit because I was watching a salon called the Digital Unconscious and Videodrome and Beyond, and Janine Marchesalt, I'm probably brutalizing her name, was saying that there's a privatization of the public sphere, right? And so she was linking that to idea like Videodrome being that, like going out on public airwaves or whatever. But Zizek said that there was a privatization of the public sphere. And so essentially, like this goes to the phone being, to go back to your point about my point, in my notes I had that the phone is essentially a modernist contract machine, either explicitly or implicitly. When you pick up the phone implicitly, you're consenting to conversation. Now, that gets very wavy because you're not consenting to who it is. And if you have some really nasty figure threatening you or sexually harassing you, especially as a woman, you're not consenting to that, right? You're not at all. And so it means, well, so what did we do after the fact? Now, technology caught up, and now we can look and have caller ID. And so when you see someone's name, you're really consenting to who that is. But if they're even a friend or someone who's yelling at you and you discover, like, you didn't consent to that, you consented to talk to that person. But nevertheless, you are giving a sort of approval, like, I'm going to pick this up and talk to this person, giving my permission, right? But it's softer than, like, this person's at my door, I'm going to let them in. So what's happened is we have more and more implicit consent constantly being developed by technology. It's like all of this is in effect more like things get more and more nebulous, where first someone had to come to your home and you could say, I can't let you in right now, or I'm sick, or I can't do this, I can't do that, like hypothetically speaking, right? It's like for whatever reason. Like then it becomes the phone call. Well, you can kind of avoid a phone call, or you can let it go to the answer machine. You can text someone, hey, I can't talk right now. So then now we have internet ads, right? You get an ad blocker, but to a certain extent, if you're watching something, you're consenting now to ads for products being piped into your eyes. And so, like, I think it's important for us to realize what we're consenting to by picking something up, watching the screen, whatever, and have a proactive stance on that, because we're kind of trained into having a more reactive, passive stance.
Right. Yeah. And so there's this, in this hyper-connected context, there's this dynamic where it's like, even if you don't agree to pick up the phone, right, there's messages that are transmitting either directly to you or just like to public spaces, you know,
Right.
on social media. And so someone can be talking like on your public Facebook wall up to you, or they could be talking about you wherever, and all these things. And
Right.
so that's just out there. And so an interesting thing is you mentioned this idea that actually you got from watching this video, which actually the person there got from Slavoj Žižek, right? And so this is the way in which, you know, what's talked about in the story in the film, where these ideas come in and then they enter into our minds, and and then that just sort of, it builds up and becomes who we are, what we think, and such. So the on some level that seems very banal. Like, you know, of course, if you hear something, you'll remember it and you'll think about it, and it's part of how you understand things.
Right.
But what you get, what you can get is something much more insidious, where it's made with these sort of deeper sort of psychological understandings, and so you can hear, you know, 1,000 things a day. You know, there's the parable in the Borges story about, you have the ring and you can hear the language of birds. But if there's just birds everywhere, it's, you know, you're not actually going to think about it or hear the birds. But if someone can sort of interject and be like, actually, it's actually just this one stream. It's Shakespeare's memory. It's this thing that you have been made to really want, and now I'm going to put this into you. That's something that really sort of resonates and just sort of sticks with you. similar to how separately, the language offered through Shakespeare's plays already resonates with this narrator who understands things via the sort of languages and metaphors of Shakespeare that shapes how we
Right.
understand things like jealousy and so on.
Yeah. Well, I just thought of this. What if the narrator was hasty and he gave up the memory? Like Shakespeare, we don't know how. I don't, as a scholar of English literature, you may know this, but I don't know at what age Shakespeare wrote his first play. And so, without that information, like I'm guessing he probably got started writing pretty well, like cutting his teeth and really developing his chops as a writer in his mid to late teens, in his 20s, in his 30s. Like, I'm guessing that there was a lifetime of accumulation of things, and that he started cognitively getting a lot better at simile, metaphor, metimony, whatever, all these different elements of literary perfection and construction. And our narrator, had this memory for, I think a few years in that story, but was that enough to totally shape the way that we see little vignettes of it. We see cracks in the wall of his psyche where Shakespeare's capacity for metaphor may have been emerging in him, but he might have developed it in time. He might have developed the capacity to put things together, but he wasn't interested in losing himself quite literally to do so, which I think is a good point, because to write as Shakespeare would not be to write as yourself at all, and you wouldn't be able to take the credit. And so this idea of, well, I want this from an egotistical level, but if you have to transform to someone else, you're not doing it on your own, unless it's transforming into a better version of you that still has some modicum of your own creative enterprises and faculties at play, right? So that's a good point there. I kind of considered, and yes, like quoting something that's quoting Zizek, it's like that the rabbit trail there is as deep as it goes. We have that ability now with the internet, but what does it often go to? Well, and I've done this before too. I'm not passing judgment. Watching a bunch of videos on YouTube. So Videodrome didn't have an algorithm. It didn't adjust its programming dynamically based upon what you just watched, or to tell you what it thinks you should watch. So it's interesting. A movie now would probably factor heavily in something to do with an algorithm, something that was predictive and machine learning enabled, that showed you the kind of violence or violation that your psyche wanted. And so, like, that's a very negative element of technology now, is the more passive it trains our viewership to be. It's like, oh, let me autoplay this for you. And it's going to be related to this last video that you clicked on, because if you like that, you'll love this. So there's an element there where Videodrome's sleazy capacity to just predict general indulgence in violence and sexuality has now been kind of even outperformed by outlets' capacity for specifically predicting your predilections towards certain videos, right? So like if you enjoy like very niche stuff too, people are catapulted into these niches of viewership by these algorithms, and they're actually a way of radicalizing your taste. I know that's a very strong word, but into these niches, almost like a doctorate in niche, because that's kind of with doctorate programs, like, well, I'm going to specialize in this element of this subject at this moment in history, at this span of years. It's like, okay, so here's YouTube giving you these kinds of cat videos with this kind of stuff at this time. Enjoy.
Yeah. Also, to go back to what you were saying about what he could have done if he had kept the memory longer. I mean, interestingly, one of the first things we learn about him is that his claim to fame as a Shakespeare scholar was already that he wrote this book, Shakespeare Chronology.
Yeah.
And so he's in accepting the memory, he's already like obsessed with this idea that knowing the sort of precise sequence of events in Shakespeare's life are very important. But what I think is interesting and highlighted by the fact that he doesn't recognize the train is that even in theory, if like over time he learned how to write by like reliving Shakespeare's life in some way, and that was he was able to write, you know, new, say, Shakespeare quality plays, is he would be writing them seemingly set in, you know, Shakespeare's sort of era, and divorced from the sort of present, and addressing, you know, the way people were living then, the concerns of that moment. But something that I thought was interesting is, so this is from 1983, but you see in the postscript at the end of the story, it's actually just set in 1924, and so Borges is going a bit into the past, and not quite, you know, setting it into the like the high tech, you know, world that Cronenberg is doing, and that at the same time you have the rise of cyberpunk, and you have all these works getting into this really like high tech world. And so you have these elements about, you know, memory and media and the phone and such, but it's there is some remove where he's like, hold up, we have like things we haven't really accounted for like decades ago that, you know,
Right.
this story is going to sort of shed light on. But if all you have is Shakespeare's memory, you do miss out on all of that, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to head out soon. I guess you want to lead into closing comments?
Oh, we can chat for a few more. Oh boy, lots of stuff. Well, I just have to say, I plan on reading a lot more Borges. I mean, I already was familiar with him as an author. You kind of have to be if you consider yourself a lover of literature in any capacity. But falling down that rabbit hole of some of his stuff, I really, one thing that made me appreciate his technical excellence and his capacity for predating a lot of research, or again, like in the 80s when he was writing, in earlier, of course, you know, one of his last stories, as you said, was the one written in 83. But like in the God's script, I should articulate and enunciate. Borges says, before he sights the sea, the traveler feels a quickening of the blood. What we know now is that when we recognize a visual cue of something that reminds us of something, like a memory, our heart rate increases. An increased heart rate occurs prior to it. It can induce a memory search in our brain. And so the scientific spelled out in the literary is something that I find very fascinating. And I would just recommend that listeners check out this book. Someone already wrote Borges and Memory: Encounters with the Human Brain. I mean, so just that lets people know, like, this dude really was fascinated in the brain and memory. And so just an excellent story to pair with something that's all about the brain's physical and psychological response to video in the form of Videodrome. So couldn't have been much of a better author to pair there. So that's some further reading. You know, I would say that anyone out there, if you like Videodrome, check out more of Cronenberg's work, because you really, I mean, if you have a stomach for the gore, I mean, you kind of have to get through that. And I've watched some stuff. I mean, I'm not very queasy when it comes to that. So closing remarks. Well, I would definitely say that Brian Oblivion's obsession with creating videotapes, sometimes thousands a day, according to his daughter, doesn't that remind you of like influencers and creators who just upload reams and reams of stuff to TikTok or YouTube? Like, that hit me. I was like, oh, so he developed a compulsion with the media that he was studying. It began to use him, right? He became a mimetic agent of this stuff. And mimetics is another way that we could really look at Videodrome. It's like this narrative or these things living through you, right? Meme, like, just there's a lot that's been made of mimetics and a lot of confusion, but really a meme is like an idea or concept that's transferred, and then survival of the fittest kind of logic is applied, like that which works propagates. And so you can view Videodrome through that lens of a sort of, we could say, metaphor for watching violence, developing tolerance to it, and passing that on, and kind of normalizing that. So let's see, anything else I want to hit on from notes? I think we talked about how both of the stories have something to do with trauma, which I really I really think is important to realize. That's kind of the unique aspect I can bring to it. The conversation of heterotopia is something I can just briefly hit on, that Foucault, because that's from that salon, The Digital Unconscious and Videodrome Beyond. Alana Thane, who's a really cool professor of media studies, discussed that Videodrome is a heterotopia, or a space that has more layers of meaning or relationships to other places than immediately meet the eye. So, in other words, heterotopia is a physical representation or approximation of a utopia, or a parallel space such as prison that contains undesirable bodies to make a real utopian space possible. So, there's a lot of layers there. There's different types. But it seems like, so Videodrome is created as this sort of site where you can act out these horrible things or view them. And so what hit me is, in our world now, rather than those coming to us, rather than us having these heterotopias explicitly, like people can watch whatever they want to from their computer, right? And their room becomes that. And I think people are missing, in our era of Zoom meetings, their work being a kind of cathected place with psychic energy of like networking or that kind of thing. The physical spaces that represent something is something that, for now, in our time of COVID, has been somewhat lacking. I think that's why people can kind of want some variation, right? And so that hit me, that Cronenberg was right in predicting that people would watch more and more desensitized sort of pornographic material, but it would be from a mundane setting and not from like a heterotopia, a crisis heterotopia, which Foucault defines as a space like a boarding school or motel room where activities like coming of age or honeymoon take place out of sight. So it's like out of sight, privatized spaces. Well, that just your room or your little space is that now. So YouTubers have a space that's like that, and they send it to your room and you watch it. And so I found that very fascinating to consider how much has become abstract now that was predicted to be more physical and visceral. So if you had any thoughts on that, it'd be cool to hear.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on your suggestion of reading more Borges story, where you've been posting recently about, sort of related somewhat to what we've been talking about, but training your brain where, you started small, read 10 pages a day, then read 20 pages a day, scale up. I mean, one of the great things, besides, that Borges is a great writer, is he has all of these very short stories. So the one we're talking about now is something like 9 pages or something. And there's a lot that are even shorter than that. And so I think, for some people who have maybe fallen out of really sustained reading, you could just read through one Borges story and have this like completed reading. And then, the next day do two, and then you plow through, this whole long book. And so I think he's maybe like a good, person to really pick up if you want to try to start reading more. As to this idea of these sort of spaces, so I think it's interesting, because it starts out in the movie, it's this weird blend where he's running a sort of legitimate channel, but then he's also working with a sort of pirated broadcaster, and so you have this idea. It's civic TV is the TV you bring to bed with you.
Yes,
and so it's so even on being like a normal broadcast, it's imagined as this sort of subversive nighttime sort of television and so on, and so what we get more and more of is that things become sort of widely permeating, they become mobile and such. There's also the sort of play on words of like the television you bring to bed with you, because it's the idea is then you play out those fantasies actually in the bedroom and besides watching them there. So there's this dynamic of that what starts out as a sort of private viewing then becomes the sort of more public experience, and then becomes, in some ways, reality is shaped by all of these things.
Right.
And something I thought was interesting at the end of the story is how he doesn't actually seem to really learn a lesson about focusing on himself in some ways, where what he worries about is he's going to lose his parents' language, and so much of his own memories are caught up in that, and so he's going to lose his sanity.
Right.
And so what he decides is like, well, to replace Shakespeare's memory, I guess I'll just become a William Blake scholar, and I'll know everything there is to know about William Blake, and I'll fill my mind with William Blake, and then that will be sort of the solution. But you know, there's he sort of loses any sort of expectation of establishing his own sort of private identity, private spaces. Everything is about connecting outward to others and bringing in things to fill in his reality. That I think is also what is going on in some interesting ways in the movies. So Brian Oblivion sets up this homeless shelter where everyone gets a little pod with a TV, and this idea,
cathode ray.
The idea that, you know, by watching television, they'll be re-immersed into society.
Yeah.
And so there's the way in which there's a psychological level of, you know, media shapes you, which, you know, I think at this point is very not profound, but and then there's also the how central it is that, like, you have to watch television and you have to keep up with all these things in order to be part of society. And so what Max sort of preys on in his business is that if people are watching this more and more, they're going to need more and more new content, and so he's pushing things in new directions. But what'll be interesting to continue to explore further is, you know, this sort of really high quality content in terms of these like really distinct visions. And so it's great to explore Cronenberg's vision with Videodrome here, and to think about Borges and you know, particularly this very late Borges, separate from you know, the 1940s, where a lot of his earlier stuff is from, but all of a sudden in this moment of, you know, the rise of cyberpunk and the things like Videodrome, he's still putting out these sort of original ideas in line with a lot of other things, but it's really sort of very interesting sort of look into what it means to study things and to read things and to like become someone understood who understands yourself in relationship to whether it's Shakespeare or Videodrome or even the sort of like radio broadcast therapy and what that does.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got, reading 10 pages a day, like that's, and then increasing, that's just shaping, that's behavioral, like that's behavioral therapy 101, like getting your foot in the door, doing something, passing under resistance, being able to basically debate yourself into making the change that you want to see. So what is the smallest, most absurd level at which you can get back into reading, right? People will sometimes say, well, I want to read 50 pages a day. Will you do that? Well, I want to, and I think I should. Okay, but that's not the question. Can you right now, or do you think that you would? Well, maybe not. Okay, so can you do 10? Oh, sure. Okay, it's almost like tapping into human systems of resistance in your own brain and overcoming it is the key to getting rid of procrastination, right? So it's like read a small number of pages and then cut yourself off when it's getting good. It's like, no, I want to keep reading. It's like, good. Okay, then do it. And now you've reversed procrastination. And so that's kind of where I was going with those tweets and those posts. But getting back into the cathode ray mission in the movie where people are reintroduced into society through television. You know, it's like, eat your gruel, watch your mind-numbing stuff and have a conversation. Watch your reality TV. Listen, I've watched reality TV. right? I've eaten from the dumpster of ideology, the same as the rest of us, to mime and to repeat Zizek lovingly. Like every day I'm eating from the dumpster of ideology, right? Like I get it. I understand it. And it's that predates like the must-see TV phenomenon by only a few years, because that would come to pass as like, you know, with Full House and Family Matters, it's like water cooler TV, right? If you can't talk at the water cooler about TV, what are you going to discuss? Well, I could ask my neighbor or my coworker about his life. No, don't do that. Ask about Urkel and the characters on Full House, you moron. Like, oh, okay. So that becomes sort of the way, like, yeah, the uncivilized person who can't talk about whatever, like Maude or All in the Family, needs to be, you know, have their eyes clockwork oranged at the cathode ray mission to integrate into society. And it's like, okay. So it's like a mimetic conditioning camp in many ways. Like, get on the same level with everyone else who's talking about these shows. I think that's probably Cronenberg's most over the top, you know, brick in the face metaphor in the movie. Actually, is not even like the visceral stuff, but the fact that there's an entire building dedicated to like a methadone clinic for TV and memes, right? For mimetics. Like, you need to be on the same page here with society and get civilized. It's like, and so, you know, the difference between that being one way and then the radio show being two ways, pretty clear. But even with the radio show, you got to keep it entertaining, right? So some of those call-in shows, it's like, it's entertainment first and foremost, and then it's help second most. Now, not always. I think there's some pretty ethical radio doctors and radio personalities. I can't speak completely to Dr. Ruth and Laura as people. I know growing up, I would hear Dr. Laura, and she would be very to the point with a lot of callers. And again, I'm not making a moralistic comment on that either way. I'm saying it just came across like, well, you need to do this for your husband. You need to do that. I got to go. Bye. And so, again, I think it was supposed to be that. That's what the show was argued at. I mean, it wasn't, people knew what they were getting into, but it is a sort of self-help as entertainment. The fact that Cronenberg put a character in like that, I think, was very intelligent, because there's different forms of media addiction or involvement. And it can be the kind where you get visceral gore stuff in your face, or it can be the kind where you really want to learn just what you can do to grow and collect that sort of self-help stuff. But it's like, you got to apply it too, right? Like, knowledge is only useful to you to grow if you apply it. So anyway, that's my tangent on that. But I really enjoy the cathode ray mission is a part of the movie that really speaks to me, because I think it's like, if you've ever spoken to somebody and they don't know television, they just didn't grow up watching TV or anything like that, it's like, you can still find something pretty cool to talk to them about, and arguably even cooler. But the movie makes it to be like, and some people will say, well, you really need to know that stuff and talk about it, right? And I'm not even going to get specific with the kind of shows people do that with now. You can fill in the gaps, but I mean, there are quite a few where it's like hashtag, you know, such and such TV show. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And so with the story, you know, there's in this wider literary context, you know, something I thought about is, you know, going back into the 60s, you have something like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which has this idea in a technological sense of, you know, androids, and you upload memories into them. And what does that do in terms of creating like something of a person?
Right.
And then a few years before this, Shakespeare's Memory, you have William Gibson writes Johnny Mnemonic, where he's a mnemonic courier. They upload memories into his head, and it's sort of overwriting his own, and he's carrying this around and such. But there's something still very striking in Borges' vision here in 1983, and I think what you have articulated very well is his understanding of how memory works is very thorough and sort of insightful, and then also the dynamic of trauma in the way in which this sort of things are passed on person to person is very interesting, where it's not just the sort of, in Johnny Mnemonic, it's this business deal. I'll pay you to carry this memory. okay, and then there's a danger to being caught up in the Yakuza, whatever, and then it creates a sort of excitement, sort of actiony story. But the trauma of having this burden and then needing to pass it on to someone else. I was also reminded of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the guy is cursed cursed, and then he has to go and like pass on the story, and so he goes to like the wedding, and he's like shaking the guy, and it's like I have to tell you this story, and I think that there might be something there, because this whole collection that this was published in, Shakespeare's Memory, there's so much British Romanticism going on. There's another story that starts with Whelan Blake's Tiger. In this story and some others, he's talking about Thomas de Quincey, who's this sort of British Romantic era essayist, and then there's also another essayist, Charles Lamb, from the era, who's coming up in the sort of starting story of the collection.
Right.
So I think maybe there is something in particular to that Coleridge point, but there's that dynamic of like, it's not just about how we inherit memories and we're a collection of memories, but actually we're more than memories, because there's also understanding and will and all these things. But the dynamic of what memories get passed around and why, and the psychology of that is in some ways, quite alarming, and something to really sort of take note on. And so both Cronenberg and Borges here are really like stopping and looking at that dynamic of, what are the desires and the drives that are pushing this reproduction of ideas in media, and how that happens and why. And so it's really interesting to go back to this moment of early 1983 and look at what these two great visionaries are doing. And so thank you for coming on and informing that rich psychological element of how this is all working, this context.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. I always enjoy analyzing horror or any sort of literature, media, whatever, through that lens of what we know about the neuroscience of trauma. Knowledge as curse, or traumatic knowledge, that which jolts you emotionally and is encoded richer, is just a strand throughout literature at such a huge, enormous level that to neglect it really leaves us with a shallow heuristic. So I definitely enjoyed it. The time flew by. So I'm really excited to see what you do with this whole series of Double Vision, because there's so much potential. It's like very cool stuff going on. So
yeah, thank you. And maybe we'll plan another episode later on, figure out another interesting pairing, figure out, something else to dive into.
Oh, absolutely.
So thanks for coming on. And also, thanks everyone for listening. And so now this is uploaded into you, and good luck with that.
Yes, that's hilarious. Yeah. Here, wisdom, take it or leave it.